night, so it's really great to see so many people here. And my first slide has come up there. And as I just said, my name is Jacob Carstensen. I'm professor at Oceana University, and I work within marine ecology for the last 20 years. And I've also been involved in a lot of work with HELCOM, helping out also with the establishing the scientific foundation of the Baltic Sea Action Plan. But what is the Baltic Sea to us humans? Well, first of all, it brings a lot of value to all of us in various ways. We have a lot of, you could say, leisure activities. People can go to the beach. We really value these kind of, services that the Baltic Sea is offering to humans. It can also provide food to a varying degree, and we can use it for transport. And it's also a very good service that it provides. It helps us actually clean a lot of the waste products that are actually being discharged from land and goes out to the sea. So the Baltic Sea is actually offering a lot of things to us humans that we really have to value. But we have to acknowledge one thing, that is that the Baltic Sea is also a very sensitive ecosystem. There are boundaries to how much activities or how many pressures we can actually impose upon this system before it collapses. So we have to bear that in mind. This is not a painting. This is actually a satellite image from the Baltic Sea, and you might recognize the Swedish island, Öland, right there. And this is actually showing cyanobacteria blooms or blue-green algae in the summer period that most of you are probably familiar with. If we zoom in a bit, we can see that you have these paint or patterns of blooms or algae lying in the surface. And sometimes they even accumulate in harbors like here. This is from Copenhagen Harbor, where actually the blue sand or the blue-greens, they will accumulate into thick, dense mats of algae biomass that had to be removed by heavy machinery like this one. These are clearly visible signs that we see from the surface that most people are aware of. But there are other problems with the Baltic Sea that most people do not recognize. This is just a photo of what it looks like at the deep bottom of the Baltic Sea. Totally dead. There's no oxygen. Only bacteria can live there. Only these white bacteria, which are sulfate-reducing bacteria, so they respire using sulfate and not oxygen. So that's all the life that's down there. And that's actually quite a big area that's covered by, you could say, a dead zone. This is a plot showing how widespread it is. And as you can see, it's about 60 to 70,000 square kilometers of dead bottom that we have in the Baltic Sea. Coming from Denmark, this is almost twice the size of my country, which is quite a lot. We can also see there are some red dots, and this is showing where we have problems with the same, we have the same problem in the coastal areas, low oxygen in coastal zone, which kills most of the life that we have in the coastal zone. So definitely we have some issues there. But it hasn't always been like that. This is also from some work that we've done for HELCOM. We've shown that the dead zone of the Baltic Sea has increased by tenfold over the last century. So it is something that has happened due to the increased delivery of nutrients to the Baltic Sea. So we have really changed the system drastically over the past century. If we look into the Baltic Sea, there are some good stories. There are also some less good stories. And we actually reviewed those in a recent publication that came out about a month ago with a number of scientists working on the Baltic Sea. And if we look at all the different kinds of, you could say, indicators that we have, or you could say things, signs of, you could say, where things have happened and actions has taken place, there are some good stories. For instance, like DDT, we banned that, and definitely we can see that from the 70s and onwards, there was a decline in the DDT in sea eagles. There are other stories like that. We also have hunting of seals, which was banned, and the seal population has recovered. Now we can start debating again whether we should reintroduce, you could say, hunting, but that's another issue, and we're not going to address that right now. But you can also see that there are other issues, like, for instance, the hypoxia, the second depth, which is and you could say a measure of, you could say, how clear the water is, where we have, at least we've halted the degradation, but we haven't managed to reverse it yet. So the Baltic Sea is full of success stories and stories that have been less successful. So one of the things that I'd like us to discuss at this one here is, you could say, we have this Baltic Sea which is at its limits in terms of, you could say, the human pressure imposed on it. And this actually means that we have some conflicting interests. This has often been termed as the tragedy of the commons, meaning that, you could say, people are exploiting it and everybody wants to get, you could say, access the benefits before the neighbor. Like illustrated with these two fishermen, if one is catching too many fish, there'll be nothing left for any of them at the end. But what I like to have us to discuss today is, how do we change the tragedy of the commons into, here we go, success of the commons? How do we reconcile these conflicting interests between all the stakeholders of the Baltic Sea? I hope we will have a very fruitful discussion about that issue. And in order to do that, we have a number of people helping out on the stage tonight, or today, sorry, this morning. After my short introduction here, we will have a video address by Commissioner Vella from the European Commission. It's going to be a video recording, about 4 minutes. And after that, Lasse Gustafsson from Oceana in Europe, he will give a keynote on marine protected areas. And after that, we will have a panel discussion. First, the panel discussion will be introduced by the panelists giving an address, a short address to the topic. And after that, we'll open a more general discussion. And during that discussion, there will be opportunities for you to ask questions. I also have some questions. So hopefully we will have a very fruitful discussion. And with this, I'd like to, maybe we should take the video first because you're sitting down there, and then we'll ask the panelists because then you can all see it. So after the video recording, I'll ask the panelists to come up here and take a seat here at the stage. So with this, can we start the address by Commissioner Vella?
Dear Ministers, dear participants to the 9th Forum of the EU Strategy for the Baltic Sea Region, thank you for allowing me to address you in Tallinn today. One of the 3 objectives of the EU Strategy for the Baltic Sea Region is saving the sea. Thus, I warmly encourage the EUSBSR to keep developing its close cooperation with HELCOM, the regional convention protecting the Baltic Sea. I would like to particularly thank the HELCOM contracting parties and Secretariat for the successful ministerial meeting held in Brussels on March the 6th. For more than 40 years, HELCOM has been doing excellent work in protecting the Baltic marine environment. On the 6th of March day, we adopted a ministerial declaration enabling us to achieve the goals set by the Baltic Sea Action Plan. The adoption of the HELCOM ministerial declaration paves the way to a healthier Baltic Sea. It also gives us a clear mandate to look at issues such as excess nutrients, marine litter, or underwater noise. The update of the Baltic Sea Action Plan should also take into account the 2030 Sustainable Development Goals. And that is why the HELCOM Declaration calls on all partners in the region, including the EUSBSR, to work together. More specifically, the declaration requires all contracting parties to link the priorities of the HELCOM Baltic Sea Action Plan and the EUSBSR Action Plan. This achievement under HELCOM perfectly matches our overall commitment to protect the oceans. In that context, we announced an ambitious set of priorities. Priorities such as reaching a healthy Baltic Sea by 2021, innovation for a sustainable blue economy, tackling the challenge of regional governance. We are conscious that all these actions also support our member states' efforts to comply with the Marine Strategy Framework Directive. This directive aims to secure clean, healthy, and productive seas by 2020. As ecosystems have no boundaries, the regional governance approach is essential. This year, we enter the second cycle of the implementation of the Marine Strategy Framework Directive. Throughout 2018, member states will look at the quality of their marine waters. I very much count on the EUSBSR support also to tackle marine litter, especially plastics. We have just added to the plastic strategy presented in January this year, and that is a new legislative proposal to tackle the most found single-use plastics on beaches. The Baltic Sea is not spared the plague of litter. We count on your projects to implement approaches and to lead the scientific work. We still have a lot to learn about the pathways of microplastics, for instance. Let today be an inspiring day in sharing views of how to accelerate our efforts to save the Baltic and all of our seas. I wish you a very successful forum.
So, after this welcome, I'd like to ask Lasse Gustafsson to take the stage and give his keynote.
Thank you. It's great to be back in the Baltic. I've been working in the Baltic Sea region for about 15 years. I'm currently based in Southern Europe, where the understanding of the importance of the Baltic Sea is very, well, let's say that they're not enthusiastic about the Baltic Sea. They compare it with the Mediterranean. They're wrong, of course, but the Baltic Sea is facing a number of challenges. It's the home of, the basin is the home of some 90 million people, highly industrialized, lots of agriculture. It's probably one of the most used seas on the planet in terms of shipping, fishing, tourism activities, military activities, etc., etc. And as I said, it's the most polluted sea on the planet. It's also one of the largest basins of brackish water on the planet. So it's very interesting to see what can we do to save this place, because it is truly unique. There is nothing like it, but it's not in a good shape. Marine protected areas is an important tool to conserve both the species and the habitats of the Baltic Sea. Around 17% of the waters are under some kind of management regime. They are protected, but protection is not representative, and there is no connectivity. Spatial protection is central to the biodiversity agreements in the Baltic Sea Action Plan, and the designation of marine protected areas has been a key instrument for protection in the Baltic Sea for more than 30 years. Baltic Sea governments have committed to HELCOM, the Regional Sea Convention, the oldest regional sea convention on the planet. So we've been doing this for a long time. And governments have committed to establish an ecologically coherent and effectively managed network of marine protected areas. Governments in the region has also committed to protect 10% of its marine and coastal ecosystems to the Convention of Biological Diversity. The first deadline for the 10% in the CBD was initially 2012, but since we didn't reach that target, we just moved the goalpost. The HELCOM goalpost has also been moved. We're a couple of weeks from the World Cup in soccer. I'll bet you nobody will move the goalposts in football. So why can we do it in conservation? Governments have missed the deadlines already twice. Now is the time to get real, or stop pretending. I just recycled a quote that I used in the early 90s when I was working for Greenpeace, and that's kind of sad. I'm standing here 20 years later using the same phrase as I did 20 years ago. Get real or stop pretending. What are the basic criteria for marine protected area? Well, one, you need to have a scientific understanding of what is on the seafloor and in the water column. There is no shortage of data in this region. There is probably no other sea that's been more researched than the Baltic Sea. There are still pockets of unknowns, and I'll tell you more about how Oceana will contribute to more and effective science. Second criteria is you need to have a threat analysis. What are we protecting and what are we protecting it from? Here again, the governments and the other actors in the Baltic Sea region are way ahead of others. We have a very good threat analysis. We know what the problems are. We know what we're trying to protect. Third thing, do we have the measures in place to protect what we try to protect from the threats that we know we have? And I would say so-so. We have a good threat analysis, but we don't always have the measures in place. We're not protecting, we're not regulating in the way we should do if we want to achieve what we say we want to achieve. Fourth, do we have the resources required for enforcement of the measures that we put in place? And here it's a blunt no. Governments are not investing enough in managing their protected areas. And fifth, do they monitor the effects of the measures? And the answer here is again, no. We don't have the right measures, and we don't even check on whether what we've committed to works in reality. So I would say, as much as I love the Baltic Sea, and as much as I think this region has the potential to lead marine conservation in the world, we're not doing a good job. In Baltic Sea, we're not even close to meet the 5 criteria, the 5 basic criteria for effectively managed marine protected areas. Oceana is working worldwide to protect the ocean. We're a science-based NGO, and we're not science-based in the sense that we read other people's science. We actually execute science ourselves. Right now, our research vessel is in Italian waters doing deep sea science in the Aeolian Sea. Later this year, we will be in the Quark in the northern Baltic. I'll tell you more about that in a second. We've done more than 40 scientific research expeditions the last 10 years in Canada, in the US, in Belize, in Chile, in the Philippines, and about 28, I think, in Europe. We've done 2 expeditions in the Baltic and 1 in the Sound, which, of course, technically speaking, is the Baltic, but not always perceived as the Baltic. And we're coming back, as I said, this year. Based on the findings from our research, we have put forward a proposal for the designation of 13 more marine protected areas. 4 of these have already been designated by the governments of Denmark, Sweden, and Finland. 7 are in process of being protected, and we are now focusing on 2 exciting places because they are transboundary. There are very few transboundary marine protected areas in Europe, and I don't think there's anyone that is actually co-managed by governments. The Sound, Öresund, between Denmark and Sweden. We have protected areas here. They are mostly small, scattered sites, mainly coastal. We have a lot of human activity, still putting a lot of pressure to the marine life. We believe, and we put forward a proposal for 1 large transboundary and co-managed marine protected area. We believe that would be the most effective way to protect the Sound. And what do we need to protect? We need to protect horse mussels. Horse mussels may not be well known, but they are important because they form beds on the seafloor that becomes home to many creatures, including fish and shellfish. We need to protect eelgrass meadows, classified as threatened. They provide a large number of ecosystem functions, including foraging areas and shelter for fish and invertebrates, food for migratory birds, and also probably the most important ecosystem services the oceans provide, carbon sequestration. And then we have the sea pens. etc. What are the main threats in the Sound? Illegal trawling. You wouldn't believe that countries like Sweden and Denmark and the fishing industry in those countries are executing illegal activities in their own waters, but they do. Sand dredging. As the Danish economy picks up and the construction industry is making massive progress in Copenhagen, we take the sand and the gravel from the Baltic Sea. Last year we found a site where we've been dredging for sand 50 years ago. They've shown absolutely no sign of recovery. So we're killing the seafloor for building houses or roads. Oil spills. As one of the most trafficked routes for maritime shipping in the world, there are the accidental oil spills. We're not aware of any deliberate oil spills anymore in the Sound, but still there are oil spills. And pollution. We believe the Sound is a prime candidate for protection because it's unique in its set of species and biological communities, and because it's in a really bad shape. We have a very good reference point just north of the Sound where we've, for good reasons, have had no fishing because there used to be ferries and now there's a bridge. Excellent status of the fish stocks, while the Sound is not doing very well. We hope, of course, that Denmark and Sweden will commit to design and manage a marine protected area, and if we could be of any help, we'll be delighted to help if we get requested. The Quark, totally different, way up north. It's a transnational area between Finland and Sweden. It's dotted with 5,600 islands. It's an amazing archipelago. We are doing our third research expedition to the Quark later this summer. And this is where I'm battling my Spanish colleagues to say, what do you want to go out all the way up there? The water is cold and there's nothing there. And they're wrong. Why are we interested in the Quark? Because of its unique biological conditions, because of the rapid upland lift, a geological phenomenon caused by the last ice age. The annual uplift is one of the fastest in the world. This creates a unique mixture of marine life. Mixing marine and freshwater species, living at the border of the stress that they can handle. It's too sweet for the marine fish. It's too salt for the freshwater species. The life in the Quark is truly unique. Some marine species reach their northern distribution, like the Baltic clam, Macoma baltica. The area is especially important for salmon. Salmon migrates via the Quark to spawn in the northern rivers. Salmon, as you know, is a very familiar fish on the plateaus around Europe and around the world, but wild salmon is really scarce. We need to be very careful with the wild salmon. There is some protection in the Quark already, including some small marine protected areas, but here again we will recommend, based on our findings on our third expedition, one large marine protected area co-managed by Sweden and Finland. We think the opportunities are there. There are many gaps in the network of marine protected areas in Europe and in the Baltic. MPAs do not provide full protection. They are not necessarily well managed. For example, in many marine protected areas, fishing is still unregulated. Oceana is particularly interested in offshore and transboundary areas, and in the Baltic Sea, less than 4% of the offshore areas are protected. We are specializing. It's not a very useful skill to have in the Baltic. We're specialized in deep sea science. So we normally work on a kilometer's depth. We're not going to find a kilometer's depth in the Baltic, but we still think it's an important place to do research on. The Quark, just like the Sound, represents an excellent opportunity to strengthen the transboundary networks of marine protected areas in Europe and in the Baltic. We will collect the data that we think is necessary for governments. Governments often use lack of information as a justification and sometimes as an excuse for not protecting areas they are committed to protect and they are under legal obligation to protect. And we will provide that data. We're open source. If you want to have any information of the expeditions we've done, it's open source, it's free. We have the second biggest library of underwater footage and video after National Geographic. Ours is scientifically vetted in we have geopositions. We need strong actions to improve the status of the Baltic marine biodiversity, and we cannot afford any further delays. I'll recommend 3 things that we should focus on. Ecologically coherent and well-managed networks of marine protected areas with management plans that are resourced. In addition to that, we need to have protection of individual species who are not necessarily protected because of spatial protection. Finally, let me say a few words about fish, the second most important ecosystem service provided by the oceans after carbon sequestration. I joined Oceana 4 years ago because Oceana runs a global campaign called Save the Oceans, Feed the World. We believe we could double the food production in the ocean. In the Baltic Sea, only 3 out of 8 commercial species shows good ecological status. Overfishing affects long-term fishing opportunities, food provision, and job creation. As I said, Oceana is pro-fishing. We're pro-jobs, we're pro-growth. Unlike some other conservation groups, we actually like people to eat fish, and more than they do today. 450 million people had their main meal of seafood or fish yesterday, and that's every day. We believe maybe we can feed 1 billion people if we rebuild ocean abundance, bring fish stock back. We've commissioned the largest and most comprehensive study of fish recovery in the European Union. I'm not going to tell you the whole story and the whole report, but it's good news. In less than 10 years, we can catch 60% more fish than we do today sustainably, if we rebuild fish stocks and manage fisheries more effectively. In the Baltic, the main species targeting commercial fisheries are cod, herring, and sprat. Together, they account for more than 95% of the total catch, both in weight and in value. Cod in particular is an important species in the Baltic, both environmentally and commercially. In the past, it used to generate the majority of the economic value. It's also highly important for small-scale fishermen. The recovery of the cod stocks in the Baltic Sea should be the top priority for decision makers and stakeholders. The Western Baltic cod is suffering severe overfishing, and the stock is demonstrating dangerously low biomass levels. In just 10 years, the commercial catches of the Western cod stocks have dropped by more than half. It doesn't have to be this way. We can bring back fish that will help us to get more food, more jobs, and more money. Let me share some of the results of a study we did in Denmark, one of Europe's largest importer and exporter of fish and fish products. By recovering fish stocks in Danish waters and managed fishing sustainably, the amount of Danish fish landings could increase by 74%. That's blue growth. 74% growth is not a bad number in any industry. That's about 642,000 tons of fish annually extra. In addition to that, the Danish fish industry is structured in a very effective way, and they have a lot of upgrades. So one job in the catching sector creates 4.7 jobs in the processing industry. If healthy and well managed, the total revenues in the fishing sector would increase by at least 248 million euros annually, and we would create 900 more jobs in the catching sector alone. So what do we need to do to rebuild fish stocks? We need to protect essential fish habitats. Fish needs more than the water to swim in. We need to set catch limits based on scientific advice. We need to reduce bycatch, bottom trawling, and other destructive fisheries. And we need to improve the monitoring and reporting. As I said, I've worked in the Baltic Sea for 15 years. I'd like to finish my introduction with a quote from one of the great philosophers in the world, Elvis Presley. A little less conversation, look at that. A little less conversation and a little more action, please. Thank Thank you.
Thank you very much, Lasse, for bringing us some food, not on the plate, but for thought. And I think it was very useful for this discussions that those discussions that we're going to engage in a few seconds. So for this, I'd like to welcome the panelists to come up to the stage. Mr. Kim Sisler from the Estonian Ministry of the Environment, and Dalius Klinikas from, Vice Minister of the Environment in Lithuania. Yes, please come up. We also have Monika Stankiewicz from HELCOM, Professional Secretary of HELCOM. We have Veronika Manfredi, Director of Quality of Life, European Commission. And then again, Lasse Gustafsson from Oceana. And I'd like to ask our Estonian Minister to take the stage and give his first address on this topic. So please.
Thank you. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. First of all, I would like to congratulate you, because today we are celebrating the World Environment Day. It is celebrated all over the world, and especially it's designated to India this year. And our today's topic on safeguarding the ecosystems of the Baltic Sea fits very well together with this year's theme, Beat Plastic Pollution, for United Nations Environment Assembly, which I have the honor to chair as a president at the moment. Also, a year ago, the United Nations Ocean Conference was dedicated to the achievement of the goals for life below water. And the main message from there is that plastic marine litter is the biggest problem now. So when having our next takeaway coffee cup or body scrub, let me remind you that all the plastic that we have produced since the 1950s and that has ended up in the ocean, that plastic is still around. We swim together with it, and we even have plastic in our diet today. So what can we do to change this? And we know the answer is the shift from linear economy to circular economy. The circular economy approach allows plastic to be recovered, recycled, and reused instead of being produced, used, and thrown away. Several Baltic Sea states are running very successful deposit refund system for plastic containers. And for example, in Estonia, close to 90% of PET bottles are collected through this channel. I believe that in the Baltic Sea region, we should take a step further, and we should create a common deposit and refund system so that packaging bought from one country can be easily utilized in another. It is not a rocket science. We just need to talk to each other and find the way to agree on this. I believe we have the chance to take the leading role and show the world the possibility of life without plastic, or at least with less plastic. Promotion of plastic-free technologies and the substitution of plastic in all areas can be and should be our way ahead. As we know from the status of the Baltic Sea report, and as we have heard this morning, our sea is not in a good shape, and there is no one else to blame for this than the countries around the Baltic Sea. We have quite recently we have understood how much pharmaceuticals we really have in our sea. And we use so much nitrogen that we have crossed the planetary resilience limits. Yes, we have reduced significantly nutrient loads to the sea, and we have managed to close down the most polluting sites in the region, but we know that this is not enough. When planning the use of marine environment, we must always look at the big picture and consider also the cumulative impacts. We must respect the fact that pollutants accumulate not only in the sea, but also in our food web. Developing new technologies in order to fight against pollution is not only an inconvenient obligation, it is also a big opportunity for our economy, especially for the small economies. We are heading into the digital world full of big data, and as we learned already, there is lots of data available about the Baltic Sea. And if we create successful models to use all this data, this will improve the quality of our life, but it is also a great chance for our companies to create new business models and be successful with them in other regions. About our cooperation. Despite all the problems, we can still say that Baltic Sea region is a very good cooperation model. We've done, in many things, we've done more than other regions. But few examples where we can improve. Just a couple of weeks ago, we learned from the results of a joint project that only half of the ports and harbors in the Baltic are capable of receiving and handling the ghost nets and end-of-life fishing gear. Also, we are all desperate to make more use of our marine resources and benefit from the blue growth. But we have serious constraints in terms of legal, environmental, and technological conditions. So we can be much better in cooperation in these areas. Our region is small enough to be very effective. And I agree completely with the conclusions of a recent research which Jacob just mentioned, that the Baltic Sea is a model of time machine for marine change. So all I can say is just let's make sure that the machine keeps working. Thank you.
Thank you, Sim. I'd like to pass the word on to Darius.
Hello, everybody. It is my pleasure to be here today to jointly discuss the issues of the Baltic Sea environment. I would like to sincerely thank our Estonian colleagues for organizing this important meeting in Tallinn. The Baltic Sea is one of the youngest seas with a unique ecosystem, but aspects such as reticence and water exchange lead to the Baltic Sea known as one of the most affected and suffering seas. Taking into account the reasons such as intensive industrial development in the Baltic states for many decades, when environmental performance has been inadequate, and of course without prejudice to the realities of today, when the Baltic Sea region is one of the fastest developing regions, the consequences and main problems are predictable. Taking into account the problems such as eutrophication, biodiversity loss, pollution by hazardous substances, and etc. And being a part of the Baltic Sea region and the EU, an integrated and sustainable approach to environmental protection become crucial. The protection of water resources and the implementation of sustainable marine and inland water management are the main environmental challenges. A holistic and ecosystem-based approach has been adopted, integrating the concept of environmental protection and sustainable use, in particular through the implementation of EU Water Framework and the EU Marine Strategy Framework Directive, and of course, HELCOM Baltic Sea Action Plan. I would like to welcome the State of the Baltic Sea report, presenting the assessment of environmental status, pressures and impacts, as well as social and economic analysis of the use of marine waters and cost of degradation. Taking into account this report, we must admit that our efforts are still not enough, and the Baltic Sea area is still heavily affected by eutrophication resulting from multiple factors. Baltic marine biodiversity conservation status is unfavorable. The levels of hazardous substances become to be elevated, and invasive alien species are still being introduced to the Baltic Sea. And of course, marine litter is a pressure of special concern. Countries around the Baltic need to renew efforts to make decisive progress towards 2021 goals, and in particular to strengthen the efforts to address the most widely distributed and harmful pressures. For example, marine litter, first of all, taking out single-use plastic not from the marine environment, but from the market, underwater noise, nutrient recycling, and other joint efforts which are necessary today. In solving the problems of the Baltic Sea, it is not only attention paid by the state government and administration institutions, but also the attitude of industrial enterprises to the efforts made by these institutions that are of great importance. Today, the list of polluters of the Baltic Sea compiled by the Helsinki Commission does not include Lithuanian industries, but however, we really have to do lots with agricultural and coastal hotspots. The Baltic Sea, like all other large water bodies, is everyone's concern. Therefore, together we have to prioritize cooperation between our national and regional levels, as well as the wider international level, to take joint actions in order to make our seas and oceans clean and attractive. And my last message is that several years ago, it was 40 years of celebration of Helsinki Convention, and it was the saying that life gets better after 40. So we have to take new and more ambitious goals to make life of Baltic Sea after 2020 better life. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'd now like to welcome Monika Stankiewicz from HELCOM to give her address.
Thank you very much. Good morning, everyone, dear ministers, distinguished participants and colleagues. I would like, of course, start by thanking Estonia for organizing excellent event. It's honor for me to be here, and also for excellent dinner yesterday. And I appreciate the choice of the theme for the forum, which is to look to take a perspective beyond 2020. I would like to start my short intervention by introducing the State of the Baltic Sea report, and you have heard already many referring to it. So I would hope also that you will have a possibility to actually read it, to look in a variety of products that are being produced by HELCOM, and further build your knowledge about the problems of the Baltic Sea and also opportunities that exist. And the project to produce State of the Baltic Sea report, I think, is the biggest assessment project HELCOM has ever had. It has lasted 4 years. It was coordinated by the HELCOM Secretariat, and there were hundreds, or have been hundreds, of experts involved in it. So we are very proud of it, because it's something that we have built together, and it was eventually also the first version of it adopted by the contracting parties. So the government stands behind what is in this report, and it is being updated and will be finalized and adopted next week, the final version of it. But I would like to introduce this report with a 3-minute video. So I invite you to watch it with me, and if I could ask to put it on.
We who live around the Baltic Sea use it in many ways to benefit our economies and well-being. But our activities both on sea and on land have also affected the environment, causing threats to species and impacting the benefits we gain from the sea. To restore the health of the Baltic Sea environment, all 9 Baltic coastal countries and the EU work together through HELCOM. HELCOM members have committed to the ambitious Baltic Sea Action Plan and to global sustainable development goals. To follow up on the progress towards reduced eutrophication and hazardous substances, thriving biodiversity and safe marine activities, countries monitor and jointly assess the status of the marine environment. For the recent State of the Baltic Sea report, HELCOM members have agreed on core indicators to measure whether the different parts of the ecosystem have reached good status. The report looks into all major human activities and assesses their pressures on the marine environment, adding up their total impact on species and habitats. Combining a wide range of information, this groundbreaking report creates a comprehensive, holistic assessment of the current state of the Baltic marine environment. The report shows that we've made some progress, leading to certain signs of improvement in the marine life. For example, inputs of nutrients in the sea are lower than in many years. Smaller amounts of certain hazardous substances are ending up in the sea, and there are less and smaller oil spills than before. But the report also shows that the improvements made so far have not yet been sufficient for the Baltic Sea to recover. Most of the Baltic Sea is still suffering from eutrophication. There are several hazardous substances which still cause problems in the environment. Many species are still threatened. For example, fish are smaller and grow more slowly than before, and there are worrying signs across the food web. So, although we are making progress, the Baltic Sea is not yet in a good state. We polluted the sea heavily for decades in the past, and it's taken a long time to achieve reductions. So, it's no surprise it takes even longer for the environment to recover. Some agreed actions are yet to be completed. New complex issues are constantly emerging and developing, and they challenge us to keep learning. The State of the Baltic Sea report gives a clearer picture than ever before of where we are now, how things are connected, and what still needs to be done. In order to secure a sustainable future, we must now put the new knowledge to use.
Yes, thank you very much. And that was the message that we also wanted to bring to the HELCOM ministerial meeting. And I would like to take an opportunity and thank EU and the Commissioner Vella for hosting the meeting, also both ministers for attending it, and together with other ministers and contributing to the meeting. And I would think that, can I have my slides? Yeah, they are there. That the Commissioner Vella actually already briefed us about the outcome of the ministerial meeting in general, so I will be very short, but at least as I have received it, there was a really strong political support to continue to implement and strengthen the implementation of the Baltic Sea Action Plan by 2021. There has been also a mandate given to update the Baltic Sea Action Plan by 2021 as well, and also to use the water and ocean-related sustainable development goals and targets as a framework for updating the Baltic Sea Action Plan. And the process to update the Baltic Sea Action Plan will start. We will have a more in-depth discussion on how to organize it next week, but we already know the elements of it because, again, the ministers expressed a certain wish how this should be done. We know that it will be based on the accomplishment of the current BSAP. So again, this is a priority to achieve as many actions as possible by 2021. And then also the update will include new actions. And these new actions will be based on the Brussels Ministerial Declaration from March, the State of the Baltic Sea report, but also on an analysis of sufficiency of measures. So such an analysis is something HELCOM will try to attempt to do in the next years in order to find out whether existing measures are actually enough and sufficient to what is promised to be achieved. So this will be quite an, I think, interesting work to do. And to make things more concrete, I would like to give one example of an action that has been agreed by the ministers and which will be part of the updated Baltic Sea Action Plan. And this is a decision to develop a regional Baltic Sea nutrient recycling strategy. And such a strategy should be put in place by 2020. And it could then lead to including new measures in the updated Baltic Sea Action Plan. And in such a nutrient recycling strategy, there are many elements to consider, but one of those, for instance, is to ensure that there is a nutrient accounting on farm level. And we have created a series of cartoons for different aspects HELCOM is working on, and one cartoon was exactly about the nutrient accounting at farm level, which is a concrete way how to improve and further reduce nutrients. But I will stop here. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Monica. And the last address of the panelists will be given by Veronica.
Good morning, everyone. And again, also from my side, a very sincere thanks for the organizers of this wonderful event, which brings us together. And I think it's important that we are together because the challenges are big and we need everyone to participate. I will repeat myself because also the assessment of the European Commission, I represent today in particular DG Environment, but as you know, on this area, we're working very closely together among Commission departments. Yesterday, you had colleagues from DG Mare, DG Regio. This is a common challenge also inside the Commission. Well, also from the European Commission side, we come to the statement that the Baltic Sea is still far from reaching the good ecological status, that actually it's a legal obligation under the EU Marine Strategy Framework Directive, for which the directorate I'm leading is responsible. Yet, my message will not be a message of lack of hope. Quite on the contrary, because we also very often mention, and you've heard it from the mouth of Commissioner Vella, HELCOM as a leading regional sea convention which has managed to achieve in the course of the last years impressive results. And we see very much the Baltic Sea and the work which is done by the many parties working around it as an incubator, if I may say, of the possibility for the European Union at large, and of course for the other international parties that are working together with the European Union to achieve a better status of our waters, as an incubator of what can be done if we change a little bit our mindset and the way we operate. Let me go back for a second to the EU legal framework in which we operate. As I was saying, under the Marine Strategy Framework Directive, essentially all member states committed back in 2008, when we adopted this legal instrument, to achieve good environmental status of the seas by 2020. Right now, we are assessing inside the European Commission the programs of measures which have been elaborated by all the member states. And what I can anticipate to you, the document is going to be published shortly before the summer break, is that many of the countries which are contracting parties of the HELCOM committee do acknowledge that they will not be able to reach this good environmental status by 2020. We continue to witness from a number of the states around the Baltic also a use of the exceptions which are allowed under the directive, which are not necessarily always very well justified. Yet there is commitment to step up and accelerate the implementation of measures. It's a situation where, on the one hand, we know what is the picture. I think my colleague Monica from the HELCOM just made it very, very clear. We have in front of us a very holistic assessment. What do we see as key problems? Eutrophication, number one, And why do we have eutrophication and all this alga bloom that the colleague from Oceana was mentioning? Because we have an excessive presence of nutrients, essentially coming from agriculture. This is really the biggest culprit, together with transport, fuels from shipping. So what have we been doing so far? As far as agriculture is concerned, much more needs to be done, and this is a problem that we see EU-wide. And this is why, now that we are discussing the next budgetary framework, you might have seen the Commission adopted last June the 1st a reform of the Common Agricultural Policy Instrument, where the accent has been much more put on the importance to distribute this money for the greening of agriculture, for making sure that we assist those efforts that are being made, but not yet sufficiently enough, to reduce the use of nitrates and nitrogen emissions coming from agriculture. Intensive poultrying, intensive use of cows, intense production of meat. When it comes to transport, again, I would like also to stress a positive side of the cooperation that we have carried out within HELCOM so far and around the Baltic Sea. I don't know how many of you know that the Baltic Sea is the only, unfortunately I would add, but the only nitrogen emission control area in Europe today. So all the parties have agreed at IMO, International Maritime Organization level, to make sure that all the ships that navigate through this water will soon no longer use fuels that contain nitrogens, next to being a sulfur emission control free area. So efforts have been done, and the quality of the fuels used by the ships has been dramatically increasing, which will also, in the course of time, but as colleagues have been saying, unfortunately, it takes time to see the effects of these cleaning measures that we're taking. But this will really considerably reduce one of the important sources. Fishery. Well, you had colleagues from DG Mare, as I was mentioning yesterday. The work between DG Environment and DG Mare is extremely close on this topic. The Commission has been tabling a number of fishing quotas proposals, which are being discussed in Council and Parliament. We are extremely concerned with the problem related to the bad state of the sea bed, the sea floor of the Baltic Sea. You had seen very telling pictures a second ago. Work is ongoing in order to reduce this pressure, and honestly, maybe certain areas will never be recovered. So action needs to be really very much accelerated. Contaminants, use of hazardous substances, pharmaceuticals, chemicals. Our work is relentless under the REACH regulation to step up efforts for compliance. When it comes to pharmaceuticals, the European Commission is right now, amongst others, carrying out an extensive evaluation of the Urban Wastewater Directive. This is the directive that basically makes sure that the water which is coming out from our sewage system, which also contains a lot of nutrients, I forgot to mention, but this is a very important source, of course, for nutrients, gets filtered and filtered appropriately. We are, in the framework of this evaluation, raising a public consultation, basically asking the public also to what extent we should improve the filtering system for water to make sure that also we reduce the presence of pharmaceuticals and microplastics. On plastics, I don't want to repeat what has been already said many times. I think that the proposal tabled last May 24th goes to a root of the problem, which is the production at land base of not indispensable plastic items. So we have an holistic assessment which tells us what the picture is. A very important political declaration signed by all contracting parties, so the 8 member states plus Russia and of course European Union, last March the 6th, about what needs to be done. Now it's really about enforcement. And when it comes to enforcement, may I say that I really look at this area of the world as yet another fantastic place, because here you have the digital innovators. Yesterday we had with us Vice President Ansip, and we listened so much about what is being done in this part of Europe in terms of digital innovation. Digital innovation can help reducing the use of nitrates in agriculture thanks to precision farming. Digital innovation can help capture big data, like the data that tell us what is happening at our fishes, who is overfishing. So it can be used for controlling, for reporting, for monitoring. The capacities are there, the opportunities for businesses are there, and the European Commission is really very much looking forward to a very close cooperation among all partners to get this done properly. Thank you so much for your attention.
Thank you so much, dear panelists. It's time to ask questions, and I have sort of planned this session to have first a very quick round of questions, meaning that I'll ask a very specific question, and you'll give me a very short answer to it. And one thing is, we've been talking about the MSFD, the Marine Strategy Framework Directive, with the overarching objective of reaching good environmental status by 2021. And so the key question is, will we achieve the good environmental status by 2021? So what's your opinion?
Unfortunately, the answer is negative.
Negative.
No.
Darius, what do you think?
Yes, the same answer, because those actions which already have been taken are not enough. And I think the problem is sometimes in cross-sectoral issues, because I think that sometimes it was hard to take decisions when it's...
Yeah. Monica?
It's very unlikely that by 2021 or 2020.
Veronica?
For all aspects.
I said
Same.
it publicly. Same.
Yes.
No.
I guess we all agree that it's very unlikely, let's put it that way, that we will reach the good environmental status within a few years after 2020, as it says up there. So next quick question will be, so is this because the goals were actually too ambitious, or have we lacked true political will among the contracting parties? So?
I think the goals cannot be less ambitious, but the thing is that we're in changing situation. That we have successfully got rid of some harmful substances, for example, but at the same time we're inventing new ones. We're learning about new problems, like Commissioner Vella mentioned microplastics, or as I was talking here about pharmaceuticals, the issue which I guess some years ago we considered ridiculous to think that it would be a big problem. And also we need to take into account that when we talk, for example, about eutrophication, we have reduced the pollution significantly, but it takes time until we see the results. It may take decades to get the improvement. Yes.
And yeah.
Yes, I think both the targets are ambitious, but the targets must be ambitious to make any progress. And of course, what concerns the political will, as I already said, sometimes it is difficult, I think, to take a common decision when it concerns cross-sectoral issues. For example, new production, awareness raising, which leads then to the better environment.
It's the same here. Definitely, goals are not too ambitious, and there are multiple reasons behind not reaching good environmental status yet, and also they differ depending on the topic.
Quick.
In the Commission, we constantly see the challenges of cross-sectorial cooperation as a very, very important one. This is a topic, as I was just saying, whose roots are in transport, in agriculture, in individual behaviors of consumers. So you need to nudge behavioral changes as well, fisheries activities. So the fact that this important and encompassing coordination is required all the time needs, I think, top political commitment all the time to secure best coordination. And maybe, shall we say, the directive was adopted in 2008, entered into force shortly thereafter. Europe went through one of the harshest financial austerity moments in that period. So I wonder to what extent in some member states maybe this was no longer seen as the top political subject to deal with at some stage. But it's regaining really important consensus and attention.
And Lasse, do you have...
If there's a will, there's a way, as the Americans say. But if there's no will, there's no way. And we've seen decades of empty promises. And I'm saying this in the most respectful way. In the Helsinki Commission, we have seen governments commit to action year after year after year. There's a wide gap between what they say they want to do and what they're actually implementing on national level. That gap needs to be bridged. And there are no excuses for why fisheries are not well managed in the Baltic Sea. There are no excuses why we haven't created enough marine protected areas. There are challenges like eutrophication, which is not quick fixes. And there are challenges with microplastics that are new, and with climate change that we don't have all the answers to. But there are some things that could be done, and they could have been done 15 years ago. And there's the lack of political will is the major challenge.
Okay, thank you for your answers, for your fast answers that you had. As already mentioned, we have been successful. We have to acknowledge that in the Baltic Sea in managing some problems that we've had, and we talked about, for instance, seals and some of the harmful substances, like the DDT, and the sea eagle population has risen again. So, and we've also managed, to some extent, or at least we've reduced the nutrient inputs that was also mentioned, although not to the extent that's actually foreseen in the Baltic Sea Action Plan yet. So there's still, you could say, a few notches that needs to be taken there. You can say that in some parts we've been successful. Perhaps we've been successful in picking the low-hanging fruits, whereas there are still some other problems that remain that are a little bit more difficult to tackle. So my next question to you is that how come that some of these environmental problems that we have, like eutrophication, overfishing, harmful substances, and biodiversity loss, how come they've not been fully addressed yet? So why do we still have these problems? Why are they so difficult to tackle from a political side compared to some of the others that have dealt with successfully?
Well, as discussed here already, some problems just take more time to solve when we talk about eutrophication, and we're moving to the right direction. But the obligation is an obligation, and the countries around the Baltic Sea, they're usually quite conscious. Once they take strict obligation, they move on to fulfill it. But the thing is, we tend to design our declarations or make the agreements in a way where we still have some tolerance there. And that's a problem, I think. Once we agree in the EU level also, when we agree on very strict normatives, very strict goals and objectives, then we fulfill them. And when we keep it kind of, slaggy in a way, then the result is what we see. And the number of the countries is not so big that we couldn't get more firm agreements. I have now good experience from the United Nations Environment Assembly. There are 193 countries. There I see that the bigger the number of the countries, the more complicated it is to agree on a very concrete goal or strict restriction. But in this case, we just need to agree on more concrete goals.
Darius?
Yes, I think that those problems haven't been addressed yet because of sometimes we are fighting with the results, but not with the reasons from the very beginning. Let's take a simple example, the electric cars. It is environmentally sound product, but as it is rapidly growing, the use of these electric cars, now we are starting to think on how to use more or other substances in those batteries, which could make those batteries to use longer time. Because the waste of these batteries is also, or the amount of these batteries is also increasing. And that is the reason why we have more hazardous substances in the environment. So The reason, I think one of the reasons, or main of the reasons, is that decisions on environmental protection, they are not enough from the very beginning.
I think I'd also like to hear the opinion of Monica, because you are working very much with the decision makers, you know, sort of, you could say, interacting with both the, you know, the scientists and people down at the management level, but also politicians. So
Well,
what's your take on this?
I think it's a relevant question, the question why gas has not been reached yet, and the answer has to be qualified to it. I think there are really some natural conditions that we know it will take 100 years to fight eutrophication, but we also know that if the nutrient reduction targets are met by all countries, it will be 25 years, and that's not so long time to actually see the improvement, because we are all eager to see sign of improvement that would confirm that we are taking the right direction. Or then there are some pools of nitrogen and phosphorus in the bottom of the Baltic Sea due to the excessive inputs in the past, and this will delay this effect as well. And there we know there is an imperfect implementation. In HELCOM we follow up the level of implementation, and for regional actions, those which are taking jointly, 70% are implemented. To me, it's not too bad. We can, within a few years' time, perhaps get closer to the full accomplishment. And then there are national actions where the implementation is not uniform. So there are some 20 that are implemented by all, and there are some 60% of national actions that are implemented by one or more. So imagine if all countries would implement this additional 60%, it would be still quite, then we will reach quite a good situation. So it's a number of reasons, and I think the task now for the next years will be to dig deeper and look into the obstacles. Which are the obstacles for not implementing these national and regional actions? And it may also differ among different countries, and we should also look into how their work in the region, in HELCOM, could support the countries in their implementation. So it's something to investigate.
Now let me try to ask or pose the question slightly differently, because Lasse, you presented, you could say, had an example from the Kattegat on Danish fisheries, where actually sustainable management of fisheries had led to an increase in the outcome of fisheries, which was, you know, fantastic. So was it 74% increase of the yield? So that's amazing, you know, and we can, I guess it's a case where what we can learn from. So how can we, you know, my question to you would be, how can we spread that, you could say, success story to other environmental problems around, you know, how can we sort of reconcile also the different, the conflicting interests we have amongst different stakeholders to other issues that are emerging or that are really threatening the Baltic Sea?
I think there are two major challenges. One, our decision makers are not making the right priorities because they are ill-informed. And that's partly based on bad advice, it's partly based on a perception of a conflict between environmental protection and production. In the marine environment, there is no fundamental conflict between protection and well management and resources and the blue economy. If you're a forest conservationist, you're in a much bigger trouble, because increased protection on the forest reduces the productivity. Increased protection in the waters increases productivity. But that's not well understood. The second reason is time. Most politicians have a timeline. Sorry, I'm not saying this in a disrespectful way. That the most important decisions are the one that you can take that secures your next period. And I'm all in favor of democracy, but it's actually an inbuilt problem where we have decision makers who are taking decisions that are safe and benefiting their political career and ambitions for the next 4 or 5 years, while the payoff on some of the decisions might be 25. And it's actually difficult for a politician to take a decision that's uncomfortable and maybe not loved, which will benefit the next generation. And I wouldn't want to be a minister because you're squeezed between a rock and a hard place, but we used to have politicians who could invest in projects that takes 100 years. Think about the railways. The investment is massive and the payback takes forever. That's also true in some of the conservation challenges, like eutrophication, like climate change. There will be some uncomfortable situations in the early stages, but over time, it's both economically and environmentally and socially the right thing to do. But I think that's inbuilt problems in the system. We need politicians with bigger visions, and we need electorate who supports those kind of politicians.
I have more questions, but I'd actually like to, and I can see that Sim, he's already raising his hand, so I would like you to address that, the thoughts that came from Lasse.
Yeah, one thing is about the time frame, and you are very right on this, but the other issue is how differently we treat different sectors of economy. So when we talk about issuing some restrictions for industry sector, it's much easier in the society. But once we start cutting the fishing quota, or especially agriculture, the situation is completely different. And I really believe we need more honesty when we talk about agriculture, about the pollution from the agriculture. We love to talk about the pollution from the factories, it's very popular for the politicians. But once the politicians start talking about pollution from the agriculture, it's a completely different situation in the society. So it demands much more courage from the politicians.
Okay, we'll close that there and then move on to the next one, because one thing you also said was that, at least as I understood, you said that politicians were not always well informed about, you could say, consequences of the management that's imposed. And
Can I still add something?
okay, yeah, sure.
The only thing I want to talk, because I fully share what the minister just said, let's face it, it is extremely difficult sometimes to speak to the farmers' community and push them to change a little bit the way in which they produce. And what we witnessed in the course of time in terms of what has been the key factor to change a little bit also certain business practices is a change in the demand side. Before joining the Directorate for Quality of Life where I am, I was the head of the unit for consumer law, so I've accumulated quite some experience in the way in which consumers behave. And I think this is where also at European Union level maybe we can continue helping the member states, because we need to much more increase the awareness of our consumers about what it means and how the meat that reaches their place is produced. Because the sensitization can help also changing a little bit the supply side of things. Many of us continue to be rather unaware of a lot of very critical aspects behind that. And I think this applies to some extent also to fishery. I think the fact that we start engaging, even on a voluntary basis, with some symbols, when you go in the supermarket and you buy a certain type of fish about sustainably fish, etc., plus the campaigns which have been driven also at a wider United Nations and other level, have been starting to change the conscience of the population. A challenge that I always like to remember, because it impressed me very much when I was a young child. You remember when there was this, wide campaigns against the use of furs. When my mom when I was a young child, my mom loved to wear a fur. And then there were union-wide, so impressive campaigns about what was behind the fact of wearing a certain type of fur, that I think we've changed our fashion. The entire fashion industry has changed. So desensitization is key, because then it helps also the work of the political decision makers, of every one of us who want to reach certain goal to change. But the change ultimately comes very much from our democracy, from our people. Thank you.
But that leads me to the question that I was just going to ask, because you talk very much about information and making that information available, not only to decisions makers like the political system, but also to consumers, for instance. So, and I think for that, wouldn't it be, you could say that's the role, you could say, of both the Commission and also of HELCOM, that are sort of the assembly point of, assembling all the information we know about, you could say, potential causes and consequences of, you could say, our lifestyles, and what this might mean to the Baltic Sea, for instance. So we might ask, so is the current, you could say, organizational framework that we have with HELCOM, with the EU, is that, you could say, functioning the right way to, you could say, disseminate this information all the way through from, scientists, for instance. Lasse mentioned how we can manage, forests, but also marine ecosystems more sustainably, but the information is maybe not passed on to the right people. So is that the role of HELCOM, and have you been successful in doing that so far?
Well, I think the challenge of our times is excess or excessive information and how to make sense out of it for ourselves and for the work we do. And HELCOM as such is a small organization, and we very much rely on the countries to process and use the information we produce. But definitely I can myself personally see the change in attitude in societies. It is not the same in every country and not on the same level, but I have a confidence that this is not maybe so long process for consumer to start realizing and wishing to have a better quality of life. And as to HELCOM as such, I mean, we are not alone in this work. At the end of the day, there are a number of policies, legally binding policy processes, and as long as they have the same goal, we are actually quite strong together. And an example was brought already about the Marine Strategy Framework Directive, which requires that the countries in the sub-region or like Baltic Sea, they have to produce marine strategy which are coherent across the borders. So it gives a strong incentive to cooperate, and actually in HELCOM it works in that way that whatever we do, we always take this Marine Strategy Framework Directive into account. Since often what HELCOM policies are about are not legally binding, that allows us to be ambitious and to pilot and find an innovative ways of maybe at the end implementing what is legally binding. And to give an example, in the Baltic Sea, the countries have agreed on 30 indicators with regional threshold values, and these indicators are really important. They are in the Marine Strategy Framework Directive, there are similar kind of indicators in the Water Framework Directive, and here 9 Baltic Sea countries voluntarily, out of their political will, agreed on 30 of those. And that makes the definition of the status of the good environmental status very precise. It's no longer a vague vision. It's very precise, qualitative boundary, and it's much easier to work towards such a threshold value. So I think at the end, it's the blend and combination of various policies, stakeholders, and instruments that will get us to the final aim, and then the information is the basis of it. And then I would also maybe throw the ball back to scientists and your obligation as well to make the information you produce and the results of research you have simplified, simple enough for politicians, for policymakers, and common people to understand it. It's a very difficult task, so let's share it.
And, well, you just turned on to, you could say, my own field of expertise, the science. And we know that the science has been an important part of, you could say, the political decision made for the Baltic Sea. And if you look at it, and I think it's been mentioned earlier that, after all, the scientific basis that we have for the Baltic Sea Action Plan is probably, if not the best in the world, it's probably one of the best. And you wouldn't find any other places around the world where the scientific foundation or the scientific understanding of processes in the Baltic Sea is as good as it is here. Still, science does not deliver perfect answers. All the answers that we can provide are always associated with some kind of uncertainty. And I've been out also communicating often with, farmers, organizations, etc. They often use this uncertainty as an incentive to say, well, if we're not sure about things, we shouldn't do anything. So how would you, as political decision makers, how do you think of the uncertainty that's, of course, naturally embodied in all the information that we know about the Baltic Sea? How do you use that, for your political decision? Do we know, and what's your opinion? Do we know enough about, you could say, the problems and what needs to be done? Or do we still need more science to underpin before we make decisions?
Well, as I mentioned earlier, the situation is always changing. So we need to keep learning. We cannot say that nothing has changed compared to the year before or the 10 years before today. But we can state and we can say that we can fix the situation today is like this. And we can say for sure that if we take such and such measures, we know it is the direction for improvement. And then we can ask whether we want the improvement or not. this is what we can do on the political level.
Yes, in principle, the answer is the same. The scientific basis is sufficient, but as the requirements are always changing, the scientific evaluation should also be the ongoing process. So that's all.
And science can always improve.
Yeah.
But there's always a limit to how precise answers we can give. So I would also like to open the opportunity for any of you, since we still have a few minutes left. If there are any urgent questions down from the floor, please stand up and maybe you can shout it, because I'm not sure we have time for passing a microphone around. Oh, we have a microphone there. So in case anybody has an urgent question.
No one. I throw.
There seems to be none. I might just have like one final question that we might need just briefly go over. One thing that I experience often, participating as a scientist in these political environmental discussions, that is that it always tends to be extremely polarized, you could say, the discussions. It's often, when you talk with stakeholders, either they are completely against doing anything, or they want to have, you could say, that's completely to the other side. So how do we ensure a more balanced, you could say, discussion on how to manage our Baltic Sea, because things are not essentially black and white? So is there a unique silver bullet there that can help, you could say, the debate becoming a bit more balanced?
We can ask people to base their argument on data, on real data. That's the best way, I think.
Based on facts.
On facts, yes.
So, and in these times where facts are often being, you could say, discussed, how do you then ensure that you get the real facts and not the alternative facts?
It's a great challenge, not just on environment issues, but in any political issue today.
I don't think so. In terms of marine conservation, the only fact you need is peer-reviewed science. Of course, it's not perfect, but it's the best system we know. Any other source of data is potential fake news, but peer-reviewed science, no. And let me simplify science for you. Stop compromising scientific advice when you set catch limits for fisheries quotas. Designate the marine protected areas that you have the data for. If you don't have the data, we will find it for you. And stop the production of plastics that is not essential. And ban single use. That's all science. You can print it on a t-shirt, and you'll remember it. And you'll take those decisions guided by those simple principles.
I have just recent experience from agreeing on fishing quotas for the Baltic Sea. The EU Council, we had the presidency from Estonia at the time, and it was very interesting. And it was very interesting to hear the position of the Danish delegation, especially arguing on Western Court, which you described the situation here. So on those discussions, the situation is often very, very different from what you were describing here, and it is always this phrase they use, that social economical argument is always very important.
So next time you ask them to put some data on the table, and if you don't have data, I do. We've studied the socioeconomic benefits on the Danish fisheries for a reason. We've done it on European-wide. We have economic data from some of the best economists on the planet, and sustainable fishing is more profitable, creates more jobs and more fish than the way of managing fisheries we do today, which is compromising science and overfish systemically for 30 years. And as a result, production goes down, profit goes down, jobs goes down. There's no excuse.
I will let that be the final word, because time is out. But I hope you'd all help me giving a round of applause to the panelists for participating in this lively debate. It's been quite interesting. And thank you for attending. Tack ska du ha.
Tusen tack. Tusen tack.
Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
See you enjoy.
Thank you.